The morning of July 3, 1988, saw the Persian Gulf on edge as the long and brutal Iran-Iraq War neared its 8th year. The U.S. Navy tasked with securing oil shipping routes was heavily engaged in the region. At the heart of this volatile situation was the USS Vincennes, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser outfitted with the sophisticated Aegis radar system. Its mission was to deter hostile actions near the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz, where tensions between Iran and the U.S. had escalated dramatically. Only weeks earlier, an Iraqi fighter jet had mistakenly launched Exocet missiles at the USS Stark, killing 37 American sailors. This attack heightened the Navy's defensive posture, leaving the Vincennes' crew on edge and prepared to respond swiftly to any perceived threats. The war had blurred the lines between military engagements and civilian activity, making every radar contact a potential danger. Iran had already been accused of laying mines in the Gulf, harassing oil tankers, and using speedboats for attacks. Intelligence reports suggested that Iranian aircraft might attempt strikes on U.S. naval forces. On that fateful morning, the Vincennes' crew was already engaged in a firefight with Iranian gunboats when radar operators detected an unknown aircraft taking off from Bandar Abbas Airport in Iran. The Aegis system, designed to track multiple targets simultaneously, locked onto the contact, which appeared to be moving toward the Vincennes at a speed consistent with an F-14 Tomcat, the primary fighter jet of the Iranian Air Force. The ship's crew, already primed for combat, interpreted the radar signature as a potential threat. Captain Will Rogers III, known for his aggressive command style, quickly assessed the situation. The aircraft was ascending and heading toward the Vincennes, and multiple attempts to contact it on both civilian and military frequencies went unanswered. Based on the speed, trajectory, and lack of response, the crew concluded that the incoming aircraft was hostile. With only minutes to act, Rogers ordered 2 SM-2 surface-to-air missiles fired at the target. Both struck with devastating accuracy, destroying the aircraft over the Gulf. Cheers erupted on board the Vincennes as the perceived threat was neutralized. However, within moments, it became clear that something had gone horribly wrong. Instead of an Iranian fighter jet, the Vincennes had shot down Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus A300 civilian airliner carrying 290 passengers and crew on a routine commercial flight from Bandar Abbas to Dubai. The plane had been flying in a standard civilian air corridor, squawking the correct transponder codes, and ascending rather than descending in an attack profile. Debris and bodies rained down into the sea as the horrifying reality set in. The Vincennes' crew had made a catastrophic mistake, and 290 innocent people, including 66 children, were dead. In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. government defended the actions of the Vincennes, claiming it had acted in self-defense in a high-stakes combat environment. President Ronald Reagan expressed regret over the loss of life, but did not issue an official apology. Iran, outraged and grieving, condemned the attack as a deliberate act of murder and vowed retaliation. The incident became a major international controversy, fueling anti-American sentiment in Iran and escalating hostilities. Investigations into the tragedy revealed a series of critical errors. The Vincennes' crew had misidentified the aircraft due to stress, miscommunication, and a reliance on flawed radar data. The Aegis system had correctly tracked the aircraft's altitude, showing it ascending, but human error led operators to believe it was descending for an attack. The Iranian Airbus was also broadcasting a civilian transponder code, but this was either ignored or misinterpreted by the Vincennes' crew. Further scrutiny raised questions about Captain Rogers' leadership. Critics argued that his aggressive tactics had escalated tensions unnecessarily, leading to the tragic miscalculation. Some naval officers believed that Rogers had been too quick to assume a worst-case scenario, despite the lack of definitive evidence that the aircraft was hostile. The U.S. Navy's official report acknowledged mistakes, but maintained that the crew had acted appropriately under the circumstances. However, a later analysis by military and aviation experts concluded that a more cautious approach could have prevented the disaster. The long-term consequences of the shootdown were profound. Iran used the tragedy as a propaganda tool, portraying the U.S. as reckless and hostile. Many historians argue that the attack played a role in Iran's eventual decision to agree to a ceasefire with Iraq later that year, as it highlighted the risks of further escalation with the USA. A decade later, in 1996, the United States and Iran reached a settlement at the International Court of Justice. While the U.S. did not formally admit wrongdoing, it agreed to pay $131.8 million in compensation to the victims' families. Despite this, the incident remains a dark chapter in U.S. military history, a sobering lesson on the perils of high-stakes decision-making in conflict zones. Today, the downing of Iran Air Flight 655 stands as one of the deadliest civilian aviation disasters caused by military action. It serves as a cautionary tale of how fear, miscommunication, and the fog of war can lead to devastating consequences. The USS Vincennes, once a symbol of advanced naval power, is now remembered for one of the most tragic mistakes in modern warfare. But what happened next would be remembered as one of the most tragic military aviation disasters in history. A catastrophic mistake that cost 290 innocent lives, triggered global outrage, and left behind painful questions that remain unresolved. Iran Air Flight 655 was a routine passenger flight traveling from Bandar Abbas, Iran, to Dubai, UAE. The Airbus A300 was carrying 290 people, pilots, crew members, families, businessmen, students, and elderly travelers, on a short, one-hour flight across the Persian Gulf. It was a well-established civilian air route, regularly used by commercial airlines, and its flight plan was known to both military and civilian air traffic controllers in the region. On board were 66 children, some as young as 2 years old. Among the passengers were 38 foreign nationals, including an entire Indian family of 16. Many were simply traveling for work, visiting loved ones, or taking a short vacation. Newlyweds, students, and elderly pilgrims, ordinary people whose lives would be cut short in a disaster that should never have happened. At precisely 10:17 a.m. local time, Flight 655 took off from Bandar Abbas International Airport. As per standard procedures, the aircraft was transmitting a civilian transponder signal, Mode 3, which unmistakably identified it as a commercial aircraft. At that same moment, however, a chain of miscalculations aboard the USS Vincennes, a heavily armed U.S. Navy guided missile cruiser, was already setting the stage for disaster. The Vincennes was operating in Iranian territorial waters, a fact initially denied by the U.S. government but later confirmed. The warship had been engaged in an earlier skirmish with Iranian gunboats and was on high alert. Its advanced radar systems were actively scanning the skies, searching for any potential airborne threats. Then, the errors began to unfold in rapid succession. The chain of deadly mistakes. Misidentification of the aircraft. The Vincennes radar operators detected an aircraft taking off from Bandar Abbas. Despite the Airbus A300 being a massive commercial airliner, more than twice the size of a fighter jet, the crew mistakenly identified it as an Iranian F-14 Tomcat. While Iran did possess F-14s, they were no longer used for offensive missions. The Vincennes crew failed to recognize the stark difference between a slow-moving passenger plane and a high-speed fighter jet. False descent reading. The Aegis radar system incorrectly indicated that the aircraft was descending toward the Vincennes, as if preparing for an attack run. In reality, Flight 655 was climbing steadily, following its normal ascent path to cruising altitude. The crew never rechecked this critical piece of information before making their fateful decision. Ignoring civilian transponder signals, Flight 655 was broadcasting a civilian identification friend or foe (IFF) signal, marking it as a non-military aircraft. This information was available to the Vincennes, but either the crew failed to interpret it correctly or disregarded it under the stress of combat conditions. Failure to establish communication. The Vincennes attempted to contact the unidentified aircraft on military emergency radio channels, warning it to change course. However, Flight 655, like all commercial aircraft, was only monitoring civilian air traffic control frequencies. The warnings never reached the pilots. More critically, the Vincennes made no effort to contact Bandar Abbas Air Traffic Control to verify whether a scheduled civilian flight was in the air, a simple action that could have prevented the disaster entirely. In the high-stakes environment of the Persian Gulf, where threats were anticipated at any moment, these errors combined into a catastrophic decision. Captain William C. Rogers III, under the belief that his ship was at risk, ordered the launch of 2 SM-2 surface-to-air missiles at the aircraft. The missiles struck with devastating precision. At 10:24 a.m., Iran Air Flight 655 exploded in midair, torn apart by the impact. Burning wreckage and bodies fell into the sea. There were no survivors. As the reality of the situation set in, the sense of triumph on board the Vincennes turned to horror. Instead of neutralizing an enemy aircraft, they had just obliterated a plane filled with innocent men, women, and children. The aftermath. Global shock and U.S. justifications. The downing of Flight 655 sparked immediate international outrage. Iran condemned the attack as an unforgivable act of murder, while the global community demanded an explanation from Washington. The U.S. government, however, initially defended the Vincennes' actions, insisting that the ship had acted in self-defense in a high-threat environment. Yet investigations revealed the full extent of the errors. The ship's aggressive posture, misreading of radar data, failure to properly identify the aircraft, and unwillingness to seek external verification had all contributed to the deadly mistake. Despite the overwhelming evidence of negligence, the U.S. never issued an official apology. President Ronald Reagan expressed deep regret over the loss of life, but maintained that the Vincennes had acted in accordance with military protocols. In a final insult to the victims, Captain Rogers and his crew were later awarded medals for their service, a decision that further inflamed tensions with Iran. A lasting tragedy. In 1996, more than 8 years after the incident, the United States and Iran reached a settlement at the International Court of Justice. The U.S. agreed to pay $131.8 million in compensation to the families of the victims, though it continued to deny legal liability for the attack. The legacy of Iran Air Flight 655 remains a cautionary tale in military history. It serves as a stark reminder of how fear, miscalculation, and human error, when combined with advanced weaponry, can lead to unimaginable loss. The disaster reshaped discussions on military engagement, civilian air safety, and the consequences of misjudgment in high-stakes conflicts. For the families of the 290 victims, however, no financial settlement or historical analysis can undo the loss. Their loved ones were not combatants, not threats, not enemies, just passengers on a routine flight that should have reached its destination safely. Instead, their journey ended in flames, forever marking July 3, 1988, as the day a terrible mistake cost nearly 300 innocent lives. At 10:24 a.m., just 7 minutes after takeoff, Captain Rogers made the fateful decision that would become one of the most controversial moments in military history. The order was clear. Fire. 2 SM-2MR surface-to-air missiles erupted from the USS Vincennes, streaking toward their unsuspecting target. The first missile struck the Airbus A300's left wing, shearing it from the fuselage in a violent explosion. The second missile slammed into the aircraft's body, tearing it apart in midair. The destruction was immediate and absolute. Within moments, the aircraft disintegrated, scattering flaming wreckage and human remains across the Persian Gulf. There was no time for distress calls, no chance for escape, just 290 innocent passengers and crew obliterated in an instant. The sea below became a graveyard as debris and bodies rained down into the water. Children, families, students, and workers, all on what should have been a routine one-hour flight, were gone. The tranquil morning over the Gulf had turned into a scene of horror. The immediate aftermath: denial and deflection. The U.S. Navy's first public statements attempted to justify the shoot-down, insisting that the Vincennes had acted in self-defense. According to the initial account, the aircraft was flying outside its designated flight path. It was descending toward the Vincennes in an aggressive attack profile. The ship had issued multiple warnings that the plane ignored. The crew had no choice but to fire to protect themselves. However, within hours, emerging evidence challenged the official narrative. Eyewitnesses from other naval vessels and radar data began to tell a different story, one that cast doubt on every justification given by the U.S. The truth emerges: a catastrophic mistake. Investigations by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, independent analysts, and later even the U.S. government itself revealed shocking facts. Flight 655 was flying precisely along its correct civilian flight path. It was climbing, not descending. The Vincennes crew had misread radar data. The Airbus was broadcasting a civilian transponder signal. It was clearly identifiable as a commercial aircraft. The Vincennes was inside Iranian territorial waters when it fired. The ship had no legal right to engage a target in that airspace. The crew never properly verified the target. No attempt was made to contact Iranian air traffic control to confirm the identity of the aircraft. Every piece of evidence pointed to a tragic but entirely avoidable disaster, one caused by errors in judgment, misinterpretation of data, and an overly aggressive mindset aboard the Vincennes. No accountability, medals instead of punishment. Despite the overwhelming evidence of negligence, no one was court-martialed or officially disciplined for the shoot-down. Captain William C. Rogers III, the man who had given the order to fire, faced no consequences. Instead, he was later awarded the Legion of Merit for his exceptionally meritorious conduct, a move that further inflamed international outrage and deepened Iranian anger. The human cost: families shattered, lives lost. The 290 passengers and crew aboard Flight 655 represented a cross-section of humanity. Among the dead were an entire Indian family of 16 people, including small children, traveling to Dubai for a wedding. A newlywed couple on their honeymoon. A doctor returning home from an international medical conference. A group of students eager to reunite with their families. For the victims' loved ones, the news was incomprehensible. There were no remains to bury for many families, only the knowledge that their parents, spouses, or children had vanished into the sea. In Iran, mass funerals were held, streets filled with mourners carrying black banners and photographs of the dead. The Iranian government called the attack a deliberate act of mass murder. The U.S. response: compensation, without an apology. Years passed before the U.S. took any action to address the tragedy. In 1996, under pressure from an International Court of Justice case, the U.S. agreed to pay $131.8 million in compensation to Iran. $61.8 million for the families of the victims, roughly $213,000 per victim. $70 million for the destroyed aircraft. But the financial settlement came with a crucial caveat. The U.S. did not admit legal liability. Instead, it maintained that the shoot-down was a tragic accident rather than a reckless act of negligence. No formal apology was ever issued. The closest the U.S. came was an expression of deep regret, a phrase that fell far short of the accountability many demanded. A lasting tragedy. The downing of Flight 655 remains a dark chapter in both U.S. and Iranian history. It is studied in military and aviation circles as a textbook case of how miscommunication, high-stress environments, and poor decision-making can lead to disaster. It also serves as a grim reminder of the human cost of military engagement, especially in conflict zones where civilian lives hang in the balance. For the families of the victims, no amount of compensation could replace the loved ones they lost that morning. To this day, July 3, 1988, stands as a symbol of unnecessary war, reckless escalation, and the devastating consequences of one fatal decision. To this day, the downing of Iran Air Flight 655 remains one of the most controversial military incidents in modern history. While the official explanation attributes it to a tragic mistake, many believe there was more to the story. Over the years, multiple theories have emerged, each questioning whether the shootdown was truly accidental or a deliberate act disguised as an error. A deliberate attack to send a message. Some argue that the USS Vincennes did not mistakenly fire on a civilian aircraft, but intentionally shot it down to send a clear warning to Iran. At the time, the Iran-Iraq war was nearing its end, and Iran was gaining the upper hand against Iraq. The U.S., which had been tacitly supporting Iraq, had already taken several aggressive actions against Iranian forces, including the destruction of Iranian naval vessels. Some theorists believe the U.S. wanted to deal Iran a psychological blow by targeting a high-profile civilian flight. This theory is fueled by the fact that the Vincennes was operating inside Iranian territorial waters, something that the U.S. initially denied but later admitted. Critics argue that if the ship was willing to violate Iranian sovereignty, it may also have been willing to escalate tensions through a calculated show of force. However, no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to prove that the shoot-down was intentional rather than a result of incompetence. Reckless behavior, driven by combat glory. Another theory suggests that the Vincennes' crew, particularly Captain William C. Rogers III, was overzealous and eager to prove itself in combat. The incident occurred just weeks after the USS Stark had been struck by an Iraqi fighter jet in a devastating missile attack that killed 37 American sailors. The Navy was on edge, determined to avoid another embarrassment. The Vincennes had already developed a reputation for aggressive behavior. Declassified documents later revealed that the ship had been engaging Iranian gunboats before the shoot-down, leading some analysts to speculate that the crew was already in a combat mindset. The crew may have been so primed for a fight that they misinterpreted an innocent aircraft as a threat. Reports from other Navy ships in the region indicate that the Vincennes' crew was far more aggressive than necessary, chasing Iranian vessels even when they posed no direct threat. Some critics argue that this trigger-happy approach contributed to the tragic misidentification of Flight 655. Systemic failures in training and technology. While conspiracy theories often assume malicious intent, a third possibility is that the disaster was the result of systemic failures in training, technology, and human psychology. The Vincennes was equipped with the Advanced Aegis Combat System, a state-of-the-art radar and tracking system that was supposed to prevent such errors. However, investigations revealed that operator errors, confirmation bias, and stress-induced misjudgment played a significant role in the tragedy. Confirmation bias. The crew believed they were under attack and interpreted radar readings accordingly, despite clear indications that the aircraft was a civilian plane. Poor training. The Vincennes radar operators misread the flight path, incorrectly believing the plane was descending in an attack profile when it was actually climbing normally. Lack of proper communication. The ship attempted to contact the aircraft on military channels, which a civilian airliner would not be monitoring. Had they contacted civilian air traffic controllers, they would have easily identified the plane. This theory suggests that while the shootdown was unintentional, it was the result of deeply flawed decision-making processes that should have been preventable. What changed after the disaster? The tragic loss of 290 lives forced military forces around the world to reconsider how they handle potential aerial threats. Several changes were implemented to prevent similar incidents. Improved identification systems. The U.S. and other nations upgraded IFF, identification friend or foe systems, to reduce the risk of misidentification. Enhanced communication protocols. Military forces now coordinate more closely with civilian air traffic controllers in conflict zones. Better crew training. Military personnel receive more intensive stress training to prevent rash decisions in high-pressure situations. However, for the families of the victims, no policy change could undo the tragedy. The U.S. government's refusal to formally apologize only deepened the wounds left by the incident. Could the tragedy have been avoided? Hindsight makes it clear that multiple opportunities to prevent the disaster were missed. Had the Vincennes crew taken just a few extra precautions, 290 lives might have been saved. Waiting 30 more seconds, a brief delay might have allowed for clearer identification of the aircraft. Listening to civilian air traffic control, a simple verification with Iranian controllers would have confirmed the flight was commercial. Staying out of Iranian waters, the Vincennes' illegal incursion heightened tensions unnecessarily, putting the crew in an aggressive state of mind. But in the end, fear, miscommunication, and human error combined into a catastrophic chain of events that ended in tragedy. A lingering legacy. Decades later, the downing of Flight 655 remains a painful memory for Iran and a controversial moment in U.S. military history. It serves as a reminder of how fragile the line between war and peace can be, and how devastating the consequences of military miscalculations are. For the families of those lost, no amount of compensation or explanations will ever bring their loved ones back. For historians and military analysts, the tragedy stands as a case study in the dangers of poor decision-making under pressure. What do you think? Was the USS Vincennes justified in firing, or was this a reckless military blunder? Could the U.S. have handled the aftermath better? Share your thoughts in the comments. Want more shocking military stories? Subscribe for deep dives into history's most controversial moments.